So you make a couple of, you lay out several principles there in that particular book. You talk about abductive reasoning, and you talk about the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. So can you kind of briefly explain what those are and how that relates to in terms of the Gospels and what you discovered there?
Well, I think that sometimes one of the best things we can do when trying to communicate, number one, when trying to determine what is true and then trying to communicate to others, is understand that there are time-tested rules of evidence that will help you, and processes that will help you to determine the truth of any claim. And so, for example, just understanding the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. The circumstantial evidence is also called indirect evidence. So I'll hear people say all the time, well, you don't have hard evidence for Christianity. You don't have hard evidence for God's existence. As if hard evidence is some kind of a category. It isn't. There are only two categories, and there's no such thing as hard evidence. The categories are direct and indirect. So direct evidence is simply eyewitness accounts. Everything else is indirect. Everything. I just made my first case ever with DNA. We did a press release probably 5 or 6 weeks ago now. Up to this time, I could tell you that I'd never had a DNA case. It was a case from 1972. My dad was the original investigating officer.
Wow.
47 years later, we solved the case. I didn't solve it. It was solved with ancestry DNA. Right? So a team of people who work ancestry DNA that we hired actually connected the dots. I simply had to find the DNA. That's what my role was. Well, I can tell you that when we make these kinds of DNA is indirect evidence. It's not hard evidence. It's not even direct evidence. It's indirect evidence. Fingerprints, indirect evidence. Material evidence, indirect evidence. Statements he makes, indirect evidence. Observations of behavior, indirect evidence. If it's not an eyewitness who can testify to what happened, it falls in the indirect category.
And that's circumstantial, right?
Yes, which means it's all circumstantial. As a matter of fact, I say this a lot, the overwhelming percentage of cases that are tried in America, I mean in the high 80s, is circumstantial and entirely circumstantial for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you have an eyewitness who saw you do it, or 2 or 3, or you're on video doing it, that's another form of direct evidence because it's like an eyewitness. If you have that kind of thing, you're probably taking a plea deal. Okay, you're not going to trial. You're only going to trial if it's a case where they don't have an eyewitness and they have to make it circumstantially. So that's why the vast majority of trial cases are entirely circumstantial. All of my cases prior to that one DNA case were 100% circumstantial. So that is the kind of thing that you learn. And if you know that, it means that the bar is different, right? So all the evidence we're going to have that demonstrates the Christian worldview is true is going to be probably in that circumstantial category. So the idea that, well, you can't know something if all you have is circumstantial evidence is simply false. That's what most cases in America, and most of those are won in the high 90s, and they're made entirely on circumstantial evidence. And I've had 100% record on entirely circumstantial.
Wow.
Well, that's just because that's just the nature of it. And we have to help people see that those are the categories and stop saying you don't have any hard evidence. And by the way, judges tell juries that direct evidence and indirect evidence hold the exact same value in their deliberations. They have the exact same weight. They are told that as a jury instruction. So stop thinking, well, I need 10 pieces of circumstantial before I can get to one piece of direct. That's not how it works. They're all to have the exact same weight in your evaluation. So we need to stop saying it's just a circumstantial case or all they have is circumstantial evidence, because it turns out that's the nature of, and that's to be considered with the same weight as direct evidence.
So when you look at the Gospels, then what are we looking at there with regard to evidence?
Well, you're looking at... So that's a hard one, right? Because I think in some ways that we don't have video from the first century. The closest thing we have are what appear to be 2, Matthew and John, that I believe are written by eyewitnesses, and 2 that are not written by eyewitnesses. Mark, who writes at the feet of Peter in Rome, according to Papias, and Luke, who tells us he's writing after having, now that makes sense he would have contact with the eyewitnesses because he's in first person in the book of Acts when he's with Paul. Paul, like Luke, like everybody else in that first century, had all kinds of contact with the other eyewitnesses, with Barnabas, with all kinds of people, and they could discuss what they had been told. And he tells us this in the first chapter of Luke, that he is not an eyewitness, that he is writing after having investigated carefully, he says. And he writes an orderly account of what he has learned. Okay.
I like the theory that Luke is writing kind of the court papers that he's passing on for Paul at his trial.
Yeah, that's right. I've heard that theory. That kind of way have been stated before as well. But regardless of what the occasion is that would cause him to write to this most excellent Theophilus, whoever that person is and wherever it is that Luke is writing, the question is, where does this fall, right? So I would say this is indirect evidence in Luke's case, and probably but if we're just going to consider it in terms of what is it recording, well, then it is recording what is allegedly an eyewitness account. Now, because we can't cross-examine the witnesses, this becomes what we call hearsay, right? So in other words, we want to be able, anyone who's accused has the right to cross-examine people who are accusing them. So you can't come in and say, well, my sister said she saw him kill. Well, you want did you see him kill that person? No, but my sister told me he did. Well, I need to talk to your sister then, okay? Right. You're one person removed. This is hearsay. I need to be able to cross-examine your sister to see if she holds up. So what is the problem we have with these accounts is people will say, well, but look, history has a different level of proof standard than does a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, we try to raise the level so high that we would rather let 100 guilty people go than wrongly convict one innocent person. So we have a hearsay rule, so you can confront your accuser. But if this was applied to history, well, then you could never know anything about history beyond the generation of the people who are living that history. So clearly the standard has to be different for history. And as far as that standard goes, I think we can reasonably call these eyewitness accounts.